So hello, everyone. This is Shannon Vance Ocampo. I use she and her pronouns. I am the general presbyter for the Presbytery of Southern New England. And this is Connecting Our Conversations, our podcast space for conversations that push the edges of our faith and help us to deepen discipleship. The Presbytery of Southern New England is a regional governing body in the Presbyterian Church, USA. Today, we're very excited. We're welcoming Tim Anderson and Mieke Vandersall, who are doing some special work with the Presbytery Trustees and Roundtable and Commission on Ministry this summer and fall with 3 congregations in the Presbytery, first in Hartford, Westminster in West Hartford, and MLK in Springfield, looking into questions around property and missional use. They are also going to be doing some dedicated work with the Presbytery leadership, comprised of our trustees, our Commission on Ministry, and our roundtable, in helping us get more clarity at the Presbytery level in how we engage with money and property and do our work in ministry as a presbytery. We're also joined today by Nancy Baseel, who's the pastor of one of the 3 congregations that's working with us this summer, first in Hartford. And so we wanted to hear about one of the specific ministries alongside the consultative work that we're doing. Many of us in the Presbytery already know Mieke. She's a minister member in our Presbytery engaged in specialized ministry, which is what this is. So we're excited to have all of you here, and welcome Tim, welcome Mieke, welcome Nancy to Connecting Our Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to, so it's so great to have all 3 of you here, and I want to get us started with introductions. I know I've said just a tiny bit, but I'd love to give each of you a chance to introduce yourselves in whatever way makes the most sense for you and whatever you'd like to tell us about you. So Nancy, why don't we get started with you?
Cool. Hi, I'm Nancy Baseel. I'm the pastor at First Presbyterian, like Shannon said. Thanks, Shannon, for the intro. I've been serving this church now for 4 years. I arrived in January of 2020. I'm a resident of Hartford, and prior to serving at this church, I was out at a UCC church in Stores for almost 10 years. So I've been in Connecticut for a good while, been in Hartford for a while. My kids, I'm raising 2 teenage children here. And have been loving working with this particular church. I think I've been ordained for 16 years now. I think I'm sort of in that point in my ministry career where, I don't know, I feel like I'm in the prime of my ministry career. It feels good. It's a good time of life. Going through COVID as the minister of this church was really interesting. We'll maybe talk about that in other contexts in a little bit. But I would say, like, in the spirit of introduction, I love being part of the Presbytery of Southern New England. And this particular consulting project has brought me tons of energy and excitement. So I really appreciate being in this podcast, sharing space with you guys, but also getting to work with you. I got to spend a whole lot of time with Mieke and Tim last week.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get going, the on-site visit from last week a little bit, hopefully. So Tim, tell us about you.
Yeah, Tim Anderson, he, him pronouns. I come this way from Minneapolis, Minnesota. So quite a bit of ways away, but doing a lot of work in and around the church. Grew up in the church. Dad was a pastor and have worked for a church in and around the church all of my life. And now that takes me kind of to kind of a coaching consulting type place where, and we'll get to this more over the next little while, but just having the opportunity to walk alongside churches as we reimagine what God's invitation is for us as a people, as a place that we are called to steward and love our neighbor well. And so it brings us to a lot of different places with a lot of different conversations with churches, which is fun and hard and messy and complicated and layered and all the emotions that we feel at different times as a people. Live in Minneapolis, like I said, married to my wife, Emily, for 17 years, and am kept busy with 3 boys at home who are always busy and pull me along the ride.
Just 3 boys at home is a lot. 3 little people in the house. Yes, I can only imagine. So Mieke, tell us about you.
All right. I have 1 dog. I have no children. And she's enough. She's great.
It's adorable.
So
Yes.
my name is Mieke. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a member of the Presbytery of Southern New England. I like, Nancy, how you said you're in the prime of your ministry. I feel the same in many ways. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I've been ordained 20 years
Mm.
this August, I believe, and that just
Yeah.
bananas to me. I own Vandersall Collective. We work with congregations and judicatories throughout the country ecumenically, and do work around fundraising, strategic thinking, which is really the work that's happening here, and communication, knowing that these three things need to go together for vibrancy. And I come from years of activism work in the LGBTQ community in the Presbyterian Church, and learned as I worked with so many different kinds of churches and judicatories during that time, that really set me up well for consultancy services, which I've been at for close to 10 years now. So I could keep going, Shannon, but I know you're going to ask us more, so I'll stop.
Yeah. So you started to kind of get into the other question I wanted to ask, which was what got you interested in this, specific area of building and property issues and congregational life. But Mieke, you just ticked off really fast 3 things that make for vibrancy in ministry. Can you go back and kind of re-say those 3 things?
Yeah. So I started out as a fundraiser, right? But you can't raise money if you don't know what you're raising money for. And you also can't raise money if you're not communicating. And so you need all of those things. It's a 3-legged stool. And a lot of people get really, really scared around money, especially in the church, especially in progressive circles in the church. There's a lot of things that we've learned about kind of the evilness of money, which isn't really super helpful. And so that actually really connects with this work, because we're talking about property, we're talking about possessions, and it's the same conversation around what we own and who owns it. Does God own it? Does the community own it? Do we own, like, what's going on there? And very different implications as we answer those questions differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Tim, what are some things that got you interested in building property issues ministry?
Yeah.
Talk about being a PK. I'm sure that had something to do with it.
Totally. My dad always talked about the boiler fund growing up. And so now I know what that actually means in real life, right? So the short story there, we, the nonprofit that I helped co-lead in Minneapolis, community development work, brought us into a lot of places at the parks and schools, which is great and beautiful. And until 2020, we lost those spaces. And we're like, well, shoot, where do we go? How do we do the work that we're doing with youth and families? Oh, there are churches, a lot of churches in Minneapolis, a lot of underutilized space. And so we partnered with a church here in South Minneapolis and renovated their basement space, which hadn't been used since, actually a Presbyterian church, hadn't been used since 1983 was the story that they told. And so we renovated the space, kind of converted it into a community hub of different nonprofits. And the volume of emails and calls that we got from neighboring churches saying, hey, we have space, we're not using it, and we don't know what to do, kind of prompted a discernment phase as an organization of maybe there's some work here, an opportunity for us to step into more property placemaking related questions. And so that kind of was the catalyst for us moving into this space.
Yeah, and I've heard all 3 of you say a little bit of something about the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic, kicked us out of our buildings and our spaces to a degree, and made us retreat into individual spaces, less community spaces. And it wasn't something originally I was thinking we'd chat about, but just any thoughts on that? Because I know we're in this sort of post-pandemic moment now, but we're also still trying to make sense of all of that, what happened to us and what was before. And obviously we can't go backwards, and it's all going to be different, but we're sort of re-inhabiting our spaces, but our lens is still in 2019, I think, to a degree, right? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on some of that stuff.
I think Nancy should talk about
what's it like, Nancy, at your church?
Like she did cool stuff during the pandemic and took took it as an opportunity, which is what we did at our best in the church. There
Yes.
was a lot of worse, but Nancy did it at the best
Yeah.
possible.
So
So
cheeky, because I'd been there for like, what, 10 weeks? So
right.
it was like,
Here's Nancy.
here we
Pastor
go.
Nancy.
Now we've got a world pandemic. Good luck, Nancy.
Whoa. It's so interesting. Like now I look back, I'm like, how could it have happened otherwise? You know what I mean? Like it just worked. And I think that sounds so wild considering how much pain and loss and grief the pandemic also brought us. There
Right.
was just
Absolutely.
it was just
Absolutely.
sort of the exact moment for First Hartford, I think anyway, they hadn't had a pastor for, I forgot to say this part. They hadn't had a pastor for 11 years, a full-time installed, I mean, pastor for 11 years. So like there was this wild opportunity, like the committee, the pastoral nominating committee was overtly seeking somebody who would feel bold enough to come in and make big changes. And they assured me that they wanted that and that they were on board. And they kind of, it's so wild. They really gave me a lot of space to imagine broadly and then supported me. It was a congregation showing up to be like, we know that where we've been isn't going to continue, and we would like you to take the reins and lead us. I think a lot of times people get those opportunities and then the church is actually like, no, we don't want to change.
Yep.
But in our case, architecturally, people were down. And I think part of that, so I should say, you three all know this, but for our listeners, what we did during the pandemic was pull all of our pews out to paint the ceiling and the walls of the sanctuary, which were in need of repair. That was the stated plan. And then once the pews were all out of position, we kind of, some of us came together with masks on and like looked around and we were like, we really need to propose removing these permanently. So what we ended up doing was putting them on casters, putting the pews on casters, kind of making what I've been calling Franken pews, because we had to put together different pieces of pews to keep benches intact and then put casters on them. So we've had a flexible worshiping space. So since we've been able to be back in person again, and we have way smaller numbers in worship post-pandemic as we did than we did pre-pandemic, like a lot of churches, it made a really intimate space when we came back. So we felt like we were together. We were flexible enough that we could be safe, wear masks, have space for all kinds of different accessibility needs. The pandemic just gave us the opportunity to think about how we share space together in that way. So that was a big move. That took like all of 2 years, I would say, from start to finish. And I was telling Mieke and Tim, like, I never heard from anybody in the congregation that they didn't love it. People have been really happy with the changes in the way this space makes us feel more together. The other thing that's nice is that we do have the capacity to have a more traditional formation of pews as well. We can make them forward facing with a center aisle. So we've done that too for occasions when people feel that's important. But none of this, I mean, space is a symbol for something else, which is how we relate, or how we relate to our container, how we relate to one another. And so many, what I love to see and what excited me, and we'll talk about this later, but what excited me was how people desire that ability to actually connect. So in some ways, the pandemic, maybe it left us with the people who really want to be there and who are really wanting to dig in, which is a wild thought, but not to say I'm happy about anybody like, being out of practice with being in worship, but it's just been interesting that the people who are really there are really into it. And I feel joyful about that.
I also noticed, Nancy, you've been able, as you've put the pews, on these, adapted wheel, things and move them around. I've been able to worship with both of you since you've done that for a variety of different, things, a funeral, a regular worship service, a meeting, a gathering that, it really does allow for, all of those different types of experiences that happen in a worship space, to feel, worshipful, but also integrated because you're also using the Zoom screen. But I also noticed that you've had partners in the space, like you've had prayer groups in there from the outside, for things like, the war in Gaza, and you've had, groups in music groups that do sound bathing and things like this. And so it's allowed for the space to be, able to be flexible so that you can do those sorts of things that are needed in the community and that, invite folks in. So I've appreciated that. I haven't been to those events, but I've been watching them from the sidelines, and I've appreciated watching that.
Cool. Yeah, that's right. It's because there's something about being inside that space is so beautiful. It like makes your heart hurt to like look through the windows that are there, and the big arch ceilings. And I do think that community groups are joining us and seeing that sacred spaces are many things, and it's allowed us to open our hearts and minds to like how God works in lots of different places and lots of different groups.
Yeah, and it hasn't gotten rid of the like quote unquote old stuff, right? Like you still have the gorgeous stained glass windows, you still have the beautiful old wood, and so you have that feeling of being in that, space from another time, but also that flexibility.
Reimagining.
Yeah, and that's I think a good mix these days.
Yeah, it's good.
It doesn't feel like a brand new space that sort of feels like every hotel you walk into or something like that. Like it doesn't feel disembodied, I guess is how I'd say it.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah. So what else has been going on at the church around mission and ministry, and what's, what got you interested in you were one of the congregations that came to the trustees and said, hey, like we're struggling, help. We want to do some things. So tell us about some of that, both the interesting stuff, but also the reasons to reach out to the trustees and the way you all did.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned before that we have fewer worshipers in person than we did in this time after COVID than before. But our membership numbers have stayed the same, which is so funny. We welcomed a bunch of new members in 22, and we're about to welcome another class of new membership. There's it's like seismic shifting happening in Hartford right now. So there's, why am I asking for help? Okay. Why are we asking for help? There's this sense of our neighborhood changing very dramatically. We're surrounded by a sea of parking lots right now, like flat surface level parking lots, but we're also in like the heart of the arts district of Hartford, which is getting it's getting some energy and life happening. We're next to the Bushnell Performing Arts Center, which welcomes thousands upon thousands of people weekly. When we have tons of foot traffic in front of our building. We're in the middle of all these state buildings. We're right next to the Capitol building for Connecticut. There's just like a lot of vibrancy in life that's like trying to take root. You can feel it. Like there's energy, but it's not finding its place. And church in particular is like, we are at a make or break point financially. We're either sort of hitting the gas or deciding to no longer be a church, which I don't think is where we're headed, but we do have to we're being realistic about our funds and our resources and how we can be. And everybody on the session and everybody in the congregation who's been invited to multiple community conversations hosted by the session over the last 2 years is like, we want to press the gas. Like we want to go with, like, ride this tide of energy in Hartford and like give it our best shot over these next few years to be a church that actually ministers in the city, is a community space, is all the things that it feels to be in there also are brought out into the world around us at in our neighborhood in Hartford, also like globally. And so I think we needed help because we have this big old building that's expensive. There are repairs that need to happen on the building that are like tricky and maybe don't make that much sense when you see what the bottom line is. So there's talk of, do we need to start from scratch on some building components? We also needed help because we don't have a lot of membership and lay folks who have time in their life to devote, 40 hours a week to volunteering at the church. And so we're like, okay, we need to increase our staff budget line really dramatically in order to keep this building going. Like we almost need like a full-time property person to help us with the things that we're trying to do in the city, but we can't justify that financially. So I personally have really needed to help thinking about strategy on this, but also our session is sort of, I would say, not flailing. They just really are looking for outside perspectives to say, like, here's how we're going to walk through this rising tide or ride through this. So missionally, like I would say, we are a congregation. It is First Pres Hartford is a multilingual, multicultural, multiracial congregation that has also been fairly segregated in the past, I would say, according to different groupings. And so we have worked pretty darn hard over the last couple of years to name that, identify the roots of that, and look for like observe it and look for ways that God's calling us into being a more integrated community. And that's meant both internal sort of spiritual work at the church and also understanding how we interface with the world around us in our community. So we have very awesome community partnerships. We've also know that in order to engage our community partnerships, things have to feel good at home too, in our own relationships with one another. So we've been working a lot on our internal sort of system as a church, and then engaging in the things that we care about in the world. So we've long been an open and affirming church, but have looked over these last 2 years about like, what does that actually mean and in terms of what we do.
Yeah.
So our values need to line up with our work. And this is where we're going like, help, let's help us to like hone all of this to streamline our ministries in a way that feels aligned with our history.
Yeah, and as I listen to you, Nancy, I mean, it's a space so many churches are in, but getting involved in those questions and conversations with intentionality is so important, and also having that theological underpinning to the why of, why are we here? What are we here for? And then going back and re-looking at it and assessing it, and recommitting to it is really important as well. The other thing I wanted to lift up that I've been intrigued in watching is the other thing you all did during the pandemic was that you partnered with Westminster and shared worship during the pandemic, to, allow both of your congregations some flexibility, and also to sort of combat some of the exhaustion that went on for pastors during the pandemic, or try to.
Right.
And you're doing a little bit of that over the summer months as well. So I just wanted to lift that up as well, that, reaching out to neighbors, being in partnerships, seeing what's there with that is also an interesting, conversation to be in the midst of, right?
Yeah, totally. That was an incredible way. Julie and I worked, the minister at Westminster and I worked together really closely in that time, and our staffs worked together as well. So it was interesting and excellent for the time, and did, I think, probably lay down some foundational relationships that will help us as we figure out next steps as neighboring churches together too. Yeah.
Thanks, Nancy. It's so helpful to have a little bit of a deep dive into, one of the ministries that we're looking at, and, what some folks from the outside can help us dig into, and what the opportunities are there, to engage ministry and to get that outside look to help us imagine new possibilities and think of different ideas. So I'm really excited to see what happens as we continue to move along. So I know we're running a couple trains on a couple tracks with this consulting contract. So one of those trains is, visiting congregations like First Hartford and hearing all the stuff that's going on for them, and thinking about specific ideas for those congregations and possibilities. But then there's this other train on this other track, which is working with the larger Presbytery, Mieke and Tim, around more high level questions about like, what's our role in partnership with these congregations as the ministry partner? How do we engage with them? And so one of the things that we're going to be doing on, sort of that track of the work is having a retreat in about, 7 weeks or so, early September, with some folks from Commission on Ministry, Trustees, Roundtable, along with your team, to look at some big picture questions. And I know there we're going to be talking about sort of two phrases that were in your consultancy proposal, helping the Presbytery develop what you all call a strategic filter, and also helping us think about what our money story is. So I'm wondering if you can talk about those two things, because those were definitely topics of conversation at the trustee table. Thinking about, I think those were phrases they hadn't quite heard before and needed some help unpacking. So I'm curious if you can describe and define those and talk about what they are, for everybody else who's listening to the podcast.
Sam, you want to do it or you want me to do it?
You got it, Mieke.
Okay. So our money stories. What are our money stories? As a fundraiser, I began to learn really quickly when I was just beginning to learn how to raise money that I had some issues because of all of these things that I've been taught around money, both with my family and from the church as well. And when I first had to ask someone for a gift, I literally thought I was going to die. Like it was the like he's going to be mad at me. My heart is racing so fast that I might have a heart attack and just drop dead right here in this elevator. And
Yeah.
and like I got some stuff I got to work on. So I began to realize that like if I was able to transition that to inviting someone to be part of a larger vision that we had, that it was actually an opportunity that I was presenting, that it was actually ministry that I was engaging in. How, yeah, sure, there's still nerves because there's rejection, right? But like,
Sure.
what can we do together that we can't do by ourselves? We actually need each other. And that is a radical concept these days, it seems, but it is a biblical concept that we cannot go alone in this. So those were kind of like the beginning, kernels for me, which has then moved very much into my work in working with congregations and judicatories, where we actually engage with money and land in particular ways over and over and over again. That's a compilation of what we've learned from our families, what we've learned in school, and what we've learned in church. And we do it unconsciously because we're uncomfortable. So it's important to bring that to consciousness and then very consciously track a different way forward. So what have we had? Where are we now? And how might we engage differently for the flourishing of all people, for God's kingdom to be known today rather than later? So that's kind of what money stories are about. And so we'll be looking at what our core values are around money, land, possessions, that kind of thing. We'll be looking at what our some kind of theological frameworks to hang our hat on, essentially, as we move into this. And then as we need to make decisions, we're, in this presbytery, we just sold a piece of property, another piece of property is on the, yeah, what do you
Just
call
went on the market yesterday.
It's just on the market yesterday. This is not a new thing. This is just like the beginning of a lot of things, right? And we don't want to go to sale all the time necessarily. We want to be able to make conscious decisions around how we use these spaces, how we reuse them for ministry, or how we might sell them and then do something else with them. We don't want to just keep accumulating assets without a larger vision for what we're going to do with them. So that said, often when we get into these decisions, they become very personal, where it's like, I want this, rather than we as a collective body need this in order to live into our calling. So when we have our own pet things that we want to be engaging in without a larger filter for how we make these decisions that are based on our values and our theology, then we often get into fights with each other. And it's not pretty. And it's not necessary. So we want to take the decision making and move it into a values-based decision making where there's a filter outside of ourselves for making those kinds of decisions, rather than kind of what we want. So and the people have asked me like, well, what is this filter? It is literally a Google sheet with like 45 questions that we will be, that the bodies of Presbytery will be able to utilize, that COM, the trustees, that Roundtable, that staff will be able to utilize as they're coming upon major decisions. And hopefully the congregations also will be helped by this as well, because it'll be a framework for them to begin to see their ministry through also. Long-winded answer, but I get excited about it.
Yeah. And I know, Tim, we're doing some work, the folks that are coming, we're taking about 15 people total to this retreat in September, and it'll be a couple of folks from you all, from Vandersall, from the consulting group, and then some folks from Trustees, COM, Roundtable, and then Kate, our stated clerk, and myself as staff. And we're going to be doing some looking at theology and some, reading, some prep, some scriptural deep dives beforehand, which we'll be getting out to folks in a couple weeks. And can you talk, Tim, a little bit about, some of that theological foundation and why it'll be important and how we can kind of hopefully pull that more into the larger system? I'll be interested to see how we do some of that.
Well, I think, first, before anything else, I just want to say, I think one of the things that excites Mieke and I and the team about this conversation is that it's happening both at the congregational and at the higher Presbyterian denominational level. And so I think I just want to say kudos to you, Shannon, for driving that work at that level, because as Mieke said, that these conversations that Nancy's having is not unique to Nancy.
No.
These conversations are happening everywhere, and they're only going to be happening even more and with higher urgency because the buildings are getting older. Oftentimes our congregations are getting older. And so while we love, and I love working at that micro level with Nancy and at a congregational story level, when we think about how to move this conversation forward, we believe it happens best the higher you can go. And so I think it really is just a great opportunity, and it's always toughest to be the first doing it, right? So Shannon, again, there's a lot of learnings here for us. But again, the belief and the hope, and I'll talk about that with the theology piece in a minute, but I think the hope is that there will be so much for all the other congregations who maybe aren't quite asking the questions that Nancy is. Some of them probably should be maybe asking some of those, but they will be soon. And so that's hopefully the tool that we can help provide. From a theological framework, again, I just want to reinforce what Mieke said, where when we make decisions, oftentimes we see this in our listening work where we ask congregations, for example, who does your building belong to? Who owns your resources? You get answers across the map. And that's not bad. That's people being honest with questions presented in front of them. But oftentimes what it gets at is they're operating out of a place of self. They're operating out of a place of usually scarcity, fear, anxiety, instead of what the invitation for us is to think theologically beyond ourselves, beyond what I want to what we need. How do we flourish instead of how do I flourish? And so I think really being able to land that plane at whether it's congregational, denominational level of like, what are the things that hold us theologically together? That's our grounding. And then from there, we build on it as we think about place, as we think about property, as we think about people, how we want to live into that.
It's really helpful, Tim. And I think, exactly what you were talking about. This is going to be partnership work. There's a lot of autonomy in local congregations in the Presbyterian system, but we do have this, trust clause in the PCUSA, and ultimately the resources don't even belong to the presbytery. They belong to the denomination. We're all in some form of a stewardship relationship here, and a relationship that goes, above us and below us at some level, and around us and into our communities, into the larger creation. And so, how do we sit in that? And for so long, we haven't thought about those things because we haven't had to. But now we're having to think about it, at a much higher level. And we are super resource rich. We often think about all the scarcity things, but we're extremely resource rich in the Presbyterian Church USA, and especially in this part of the Presbyterian Church USA. I was talking to one of my roommate, actually, from my first 2 years in seminary, and she does the same work I do now in judicatory ministry, and she's out in the Midwest, and they're also closing some congregations and selling things. And we were chatting about some of that, and she was sharing what like a good amount of money is that they can get out of a space and out of a sale. And it's like nothing compared to what the kind of money we're talking about here and what we sell for. And of course, it's just the difference of real estate markets, right? But it raises huge questions, and they're having a different set of questions and than we're having, but we're both having big questions and big wonderings about what we're up to and what we're supposed to be doing. So having someone alongside to help you think about that is so important, because it's another piece of sort of who we are as Presbyterians. Like, we don't believe we can make good decisions in a vacuum on our own as individual selves. So I'm looking forward to this community piece of the work and these conversations, and seeing, where the Holy Spirit shows up and what the Holy Spirit does with all of us, because we're all going to bring stuff, right?
Want to think really quickly too, Shannon, as Mieke talked about, when you name that you're resource rich, that's a space that you want to, if you can, be making decisions out of, as opposed to there are denominations or congregations who aren't, they don't actually have the resources, the capital to do things. And so if we can make strategic, grounded decisions out of abundance, that's where the good, fruitful work, is birthed from.
Yeah. And that requires hopefulness, right? It requires hopefulness, because I've seen places that have a lot of resources in the church, and so much more than other places, and they don't have that sense of imagination and hope and a sense of the future. And so even though they've got all these resources, they're still operating in complete scarcity and fear. So I'm hoping we can continue to enliven those conversations, because that's a piece of it. And that's what I hear, Nancy, in your story, the bit you've shared with us today, is that the story could have been a story of scarcity, right? At first, Hartford, having been without an installed pastor for 11 years, it could have just stayed that story, but they decided to, take a risk and go in a different direction. And it's still scary at some level, and still like, oh my God, things are keeping me up at night, right? But trying to be in the conversation. So I'm so appreciative. Yeah, go ahead, Nancy. What were you going to say? Yeah, no.
I don't know that there's a different way to do it, honestly, because I can't, it's not working to do it the old way. It just ain't working. So I feel like it's the truth of the matter is that we're all required to step into this time and be real about what is. And I feel like if we want to say that it's scarce and we need to let our resources go elsewhere, then like that's a legitimate choice. But I think if we want to be ministering to God's glory, we have to lean into that's
a very unique response. I mean, that's to affirm that congregational response, because I think oftentimes the response that I see at many places is, oh no, we can go back to that. We can go back to that. We believe
it doesn't exist. Yeah. Right.
So it's a choice you've made, and it's a courageous choice.
Thanks, Tim. Man, you guys, like, spending time with you was like feeling like someone came up behind me underneath my arms and was like, let's go. All of you guys, I appreciate it.
I'm so glad, Nancy. We want to pour into our ministries, right? We want to we want to make our ministries happen. So thank you for being here. I think it's a great spot to leave it. Nancy, you just spoke some beautiful prophetic words about choices and decisions, and we'll definitely do a part 2 of this as we go through the next couple months. It'd be great to do a part 2 with some of our retreat participants after the retreat and hear what was sparking in their imaginations. It's a different group of folks, and hear, where God is speaking to them and what's going on for them. So we'll definitely do a part 2 to this conversation, early fall, late September, to see what's happening, because this is a journey. This isn't just, this is the only podcast about this project, right? We're going to need to keep having more conversations. So I'm so grateful to each of you, Tim and Mieke, for your ministry and jumping in to work alongside the Presbytery, Nancy, for who you are in your ministry at First Hartford. And I'm just really excited about next steps, where we're going, and what's going to happen. There's always that element of mystery and risk and the movement of the Holy Spirit, right? And so we're going to do some stuff, and then I guarantee you the Holy Spirit's going to show up and do something completely new, and we won't even see it when it's coming, but we'll be excited about it as it's happening, and later and realize it was where we were needed to head. So thank you all so much. So grateful for each of you, for your ministries, for who you are. And look forward to part 2 of this conversation in maybe about 2 months' time. So thank you so much for being part of connecting our conversations.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you.
Thank
See you again,
you.
Tim. So great to be with you guys.
Thank you.